Good morning and good evening to you, Dr. Gregory Russell Jones. Thank you so much for joining me today. You and our paths crossed about 3 years ago when I was looking for answers and potential solutions to helping my middle son who has autism. Our son was diagnosed at the age of 2 and he is now 11 and doing very well. But the first few years of his life weren't smooth sailing because I didn't realize what I was actually dealing with. And that was trying to help his body and his entire system methylate, amongst other things. And in addition to obviously having my own child with autism, I run a foundation that I set up nearly 9 years ago called the Giving Tree Foundation, Turning Autism Around, which purely looks at a behavioral approach to supporting children with autism in learning and accessing their environment and family, friends, etc. It has become increasingly clear over the years that a behavioral therapeutic approach in isolation is not enough to support these children. Hence, I went out looking for answers to what is a big problem called autism. And I came across your website and some of your products 3 years ago. And now I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce you to the wider autism community and the parents and the practitioners that are trying to help these children. So today's recording is going to be about understanding autism and why do nutritional deficiencies cause autism. So I'd just like to hand over to you to do an introduction and how you stumbled across these quite profound findings, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanja. So from the point of view of people trying to understand why their child has autism and why their child has the behavior and why the nutritional deficiencies affect them, that it would be very useful for us to sort of go through the deficiencies and why it's causing the issue. I think this makes it much easier for people to understand. It makes it more credible. It's less like witch doctoring or something like this, or speculation. It's well supported by chemistry. And so I think that's very important. It was important for me when I was working through the data to understand, well, okay, they're deficient in iron or B12 or B2 or vitamin D, but what does that mean? Why does that cause the autism? So the main object of today's talk is to go through these things and try and give it a scientific basis for why the nutritional deficiencies that we've identified cause the autism. And in that way, I think it's easier for people to understand what's going on. It's easier for people to understand how long it will take to turn it around and to understand some of the behaviors that the children have. And it seems that it's fairly uniform from ages of even as low as 1 up to people who are over 30. That's the main purpose of today's talk. And I think it's very important too. The cost to the community of this is just massive. The cost to people who have children with autism it's heartbreaking. And I mean, it seems to just be increasing. We're trying to turn that around to understand what's going on, look at the nutrition and see what the deficiencies are causing.
Absolutely. I think that brings us really to the crux of the matter, and that is if you would share the known causes of developmental delay, so the identified deficiencies that we talked about previously.
That's correct. So if we go through the slides, there were some known causes of developmental delay. And we identified these in the previous talk. One is iodine, which is the single most preventable cause of developmental delay. The iodine deficiency results in functional B2 deficiency. Iron deficiency has also been identified as the second most preventable cause of developmental delay. And absolute vitamin B12 deficiency has been known for 40 years to cause developmental delay. Early on, if it was diagnosed, you could easily reverse it, which is slightly different to what we have in modern day autism. And vitamin D deficiency has been identified as a cause for developmental delay. And this, we think, is part of the reason for the increase in the rate of autism. But the thing is, why do these things cause the delay? To go through this, we really need to know a little bit about what's going on in the brain of the children and to try and correlate these all together so you see why there's a delay. So during development, one of the things that happens is you myelinate your nerves. You put this layer of insulation on the nerves, and what it does is it increases the speed of conduction of the nerves. So the nerves go from 2.5 meters per second to 150 meters per second. So if you want to do real-time fast processing, you need to be able to integrate your neuronal signals, and you need to bring them together so you can do complex reactions such as speech and movement and fine motor skills. So that's one of the things that you need to do. So you need to increase this myelination, and delayed myelination is a feature of autism. The other thing you need to do is you're trying to run a supercomputer. And so supercomputers use lots of energy. And so for neuronal processing that's going on, you need lots of energy. And one of the things we've found is the nutritional deficiencies reduce the efficiency of energy production from food. So you can eat a lot of food, but you're not getting energy. There are three main ways that you normally generate energy. One is from breaking down lipids, one is from breaking down sugars, and one is from breaking down amino acids. And all of these generate energy in a pathway called Krebs cycle. The energy then is transferred to a little piece of wires. You can think about the electron transport chain. And then ultimately that produces ATP, which most people would have heard about. And ATP transfers energy from mitochondria to within the cell. And that transfer requires a molecule called creatine. And so it's sort of a basic first-year biochemistry rundown of what goes on in energy. And so what we've found is that deficiencies of any of iron, B12, B2, and vitamin D are associated with the development of autism. Now, I looked at this and I thought, well, if there's a common thing in all of this, how do they all do the same thing? And so we came up with this nexus theory. We came together, what's the point in these things where you get the central point, vertex or nert or nexus, in which you get all of these things being involved? And we got up with this concept that the final piece of activation of vitamin D requires all of these together. And this is just a little cartoon of the molecules that are involved in it. And you can look at it later and you'll see that it requires iron, it requires vitamin D, it requires vitamin B2, and that it also requires vitamin B12 as part of the molecule. And so this is a schematic of what we're trying to do. One of the things that vitamin B12 does is it causes methylation, and methylation is required to make melatonin. So we've got melatonin over here. We have the active vitamin B, vitamin D, and these two work together as part of turning on neuronal stem cells, and you get this oligodendrocyte here that starts this myelination of the nerves. So if you interrupt this process, you're going to interrupt the myelination, you're going to interrupt the speed of conduction of the nerves. So you can have a signal, and it will never be processed because it's too slow. It won't be integrated because it's too slow. So part of learning and development is that you need to speed up the signal that's on the neurons. You need to myelinate the neurons, and therefore you get a signal. There's no point in your signal being so slow that when you start to fall over, by the time you work out you've fallen over, you've already hit the ground. You have to do these things in real time. And for a supercomputer like the brain, of course, you want this as fast as possible. So we've just got a few little areas of the brain that we think are involved in developmental delay. One is the development of speech, and that's an area called Broca's region, which requires myelination. And the other two big areas, the fronto and temporal lobe. You can look them all up. There's the schema. Go back to the presentation and look at it. The brain prefers to use glucose as an energy source above all energy sources. So we get this little pathway where we bring glucose in, chop it up, and we do all sorts of things, and we end up with this last little bit at the end of the glycolysis where there's pyruvate. And then we get into this little cycle called Krebs cycle, the pyruvate and the energy. And you can see here, if you blow it up, you're going to see energy from sugar, fats, and proteins. Eventually gets to this bit. And it goes around a thing called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and that goes on to this electron transport chain. So these are all part of energy. So we're going to look at energy. And finally, you have this lovely little picture of the electron transport chain. And as you look at the little things called iron sulfur proteins, there's FMN, which is part one of the B2 things that's activated. There's CoQ10, and most of you will have heard of ads for CoQ10, what it does. Well, this is actually what it does. It sits in here. It's a little shuffle. And then finally, you make ATP, and then here's the ATP. You transfer the ATP out of the mitochondria into the cell, and this is where creatine is involved. If you don't have creatine, you can't take that energy and do anything with it. And so creatine is critical. So creatine phosphate is phosphocreatine. You get energy for the brain. And so this way, if you have 1 molecule of glucose, you can get 36 molecules of ATP, and you can use it for doing things. Now, one of the critical things about making creatine, and you can see in this, is you have this final step, which requires SAM. SAM is S-adenylmethionine, which is the universal methyl donor, and you need vitamin B12 to make SAM. So without B12, or without this one little enzyme that's used, you don't make SAM, or you don't make creatine, and you get nearly all the symptoms of autism just from knocking one enzyme out. I'm pretty sure that this is basically the mechanism that B12 is using. So let's go through it. I thought I'd start with vitamin B12 first, because autism or developmental delay due to vitamin B12 has been known for 40 years. And we know from the previous talks that what the children seem to have is a functional deficiency in vitamin B12. So if we look at that first, we can say, well, this we know. We've known it for 40 years. We're just applying some old knowledge to the current problem. So we went through the process of myelination, and one of the molecules in myelination was melatonin. And so vitamin B12 is involved in the production of melatonin. So if you meet B12 deficiency, you get a reduced production of melatonin. And so therefore you get lack of myelination of these neuronal stem cells in the brain. You also have some associated problems that a lot of people with children with developmental delay will notice, and that is they can have some gut issues. And so one of the other things that melatonin does is it helps in the maturation of the gut epithelial cells. And if you don't do this, you have sensitivity to histamine and lactose. And you also have some other curious things that are found, and you have poor uptake of iron and a lot of divalent metal ions in the gut. So that's one thing. So that's the two of the critical things that you find is this gut issues are really big in these kids. And you have these multiple food sensitivities and all these things that come up. And really it's because the gut hasn't matured. It hasn't matured to the extent that it can handle these things. It's not making the enzymes that it should to do it, and it's not making the processing steps in the gut. So it's a little bit like if you had severe diarrhea for months and months and months, you'd have poor nutrient uptake, and you'd have poor uptake of some molecules. And that's basically from the melatonin and the lack of melatonin, but it's slightly more complicated. So the other thing that we did was we talked about the energy production. So that's going on. And one of the things that B12 does is it's involved in methylation, and methylation is required to make CoQ10. So in that little electron transport chain that we had, there was a little shuttle vector that was taking energy from one side and moving to the next side. And that little shuttle was called CoQ10. So when we do the organic acids test, we can see that the CoQ10 precursor is made in abundance, but the CoQ10 is not being made. So the next thing that is made is creatine. All right, so we're going to go through the production of creatine. So over 40% of all methylation goes to making creatine. So you can see that if this is reduced, then the amount of energy transferred in the brain is going to be a lot slower. And so the developmental delay can occur just to this one step. As we mentioned, we knocked out this one end. So here's your CoQ10 structure. Here's the 3 methylation groups that are on there. These are methyl groups. Me is methyl, and that's a methyl group. And it's a part of the electron transport chain. And we can see here that one of the precursors as B2 deficiency goes up, the amount of this precursor goes up. So it's not being converted to CoQ10. And so this is some data from all of the kids that I had, basically saying you're getting lower electron transport chain activity due to lower Q10. And here's the slide now that we have for creatine. And this is the synthetic pathway. This was the creatine. And one of the things that you notice, an early sign with the kids is hypotonia, that they don't seem to have energy, that the muscles are limp and relaxed and they're not stiff and taut and toned. And this, we believe, is due to this creatine deficiency. The muscles are not getting enough energy to actually do anything. Tanja might have mentioned that her son had hypertonia for quite a long time. Yes. And it's another interesting problem is that you see it early on in development. It's one of the diagnostic things is hypertonia. And so it should be suspected if you see it. So the other interesting thing about creatine is that we say it's used for energy, and the brain, of course, uses lots of energy. And the thing that distinguishes us from other primates is that we have these large frontal lobe and temporal lobes in the brain. And these involve us to do a whole lot of things. Motor functions, problem solving, memory, language, judgment, impulse control, spontaneous and social behavior. We won't worry about sexual behavior in the children, hopefully not yet. But you can see that if you lack energy here, you're going to upset these problems. And the temporal lobes, which were early on, are involved in the formation of long memory. So if a child is going to learn to speak, it has to remember the words, it has to be able to put them together. And the other thing is recognizing faces. So the kids initially have problems with facial recognition, interpreting body language, and that's another thing. They don't know whether you're cross or you're happy or whatever. And production of speech. One of the biggest things that I get contacted is, my child doesn't talk. I want my child to talk. From a grandparent, having the child say something and be able to make a comment is so satisfying. And to me, it must be so heartbreaking not to have your child to speak. But so this is part of why we believe it. Remembering the names of objects. How can you say what you've done? How can you say that's the cat or something like that if you can't remember what it is? And recognition of language. This is a whole new puzzle, but the temporal lobe is involved in this. And what we're saying is these require a lot of energy, they require a lot of creatine, and these are the areas in the brain that have the highest creatine. So these are the sort of functions that are involved with these two different areas. And you can see that if creatine is low, you're going to have problems. So you're going to have problems in these. And that's what you see in the children. So here we have Broca's area, frontal lobe, temporal area. And so methyl B12 deficiency has all these problems. Now, one of the reasons we know it has these problems is because when we have people with chronic fatigue who also have B12 deficiency, they have these problems as well. And when it gets worse, and you have people now who have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, these are the problems that they have. And low functional B12 is associated with this. So we have the end game, if you want to, which is dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And from that, we can learn what the children are likely to have. And I think that's very important. Biochemically, when you look at them, they're very, very similar. So yes, and it's an assumption, but I think it's quite a valid, what we'd say, a learned assumption. So that's sort of dealt with the B12 aspect of it. I don't know if you had any questions on that, Tanja, or not.
Well, my question is, obviously, creatine plays such a significant role. A lot of people choose to supplement it. And I think that's something that maybe we should quickly touch on, like the supplementation aspect of it. Can we somehow address that, Greg?
So one of the things with creatine supplementation is that the evidence in the literature suggests that very little creatine gets to the brain. About half the creatine that you use is derived from food, but only if you eat the right food. So if you eat muscle, which is high in creatine, so if you're a red meat eater, then you will tend to eat more creatine. And the creatine that athletes use as supplements has been shown to help them in muscle strength. And so for some people who can't get up and they have problems and they have severe hypertonia, I can believe that creatine will work for them. The problem is that they have not been able to demonstrate significant amount of creatine going into the brain. However, there's a contra side to this, and that if 40% of your methylation is going to creatine production, if you're supplying creatine, maybe you have more methylation available to make creatine in the brain. That's speculative, though. The data would suggest that, but I definitely can't prove it. And so one of the disadvantages to creatine is a lot of people have very bad side effects to it. My solution in these things is to fix the biochemistry, and then you won't have to do the supplementation with the other things. There's 200 methylation reactions in the body. Are you going to supplement with the 200 methylation products? Possibly not. So,
Great, thank you.
So we'll move on to iron deficiency. So we said that iron deficiency was the second most preventable cause of developmental delay, because iron and B12 tend to happen in the same foods. And so if you're deficient in B12, functionally deficient, you're likely to be deficient in iron. And so why is this going to make a difference? So if we had a child who just had B12 deficiency, they would have a group of symptoms, which we've just explained. But if the child on top of that has iron deficiency, and 80% of the children that I have data for have iron deficiency as well as the B12 deficiency.
Sorry, was that 80? 80?
Yeah. So it's a high amount. If they have that, what's the consequence of that? So just go through that. So we said second most preventable cause of developmental delay. But what's iron used for? I mean, we're not building iron structures or girders or whatever. So one of the main things we're using iron for is hemoglobin and a little protein in the muscles called myoglobin. And these are responsible for oxygen movement. So if your levels go down, then the amount of oxygen you can transport is reduced as well. And so this then is a problem, because as you get away from the lungs and you get into the fetus, say, for instance, the oxygen has to go on the mum's hemoglobin, then it has to cross the placenta and get swapped onto fetal hemoglobin. So if there's no oxygen, if the oxygen amount in the mum is low, then the oxygen amount in the fetus is low. So that's fine, that's oxygen, but what's the oxygen doing? Well, the oxygen is involved in the final step in the electron transport chain of making ATP. So the lower your oxygen, the less ATP, the less energy you make. But it's also involved in some other curious proteins. One of them is a aconitase, which is in the Krebs cycle. Now, this marker you can see in organic acids tests, and that as the iron goes down, the citrate in the organic acids test goes up, because citrate is supposed to be used in the citric acid cycle. And so if you're getting citrate excreted, you're not using the citrate. So you're losing energy in that. The other curious protein is another protein called lysyl hydroxylase. Now, that protein is responsible for the rigidity of collagen and cross-linking collagen. So one of the things that does is stop you having very, very lax joints. And one of the things in the kids is often they have a hypermobility. Their joints are really lax and they'll tend to pop out, and they have symptoms like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, where they repeatedly have joint dislocations. So what does iron deficiency do? Well, you have a lower production of the heme iron, have a lower production of hemoglobin and myoglobin, therefore lower oxygen transfer and lower oxidative phosphorylation, i.e. lower energy. Then you have the lower activity of these iron sulfur proteins. So that then means that you're not getting as much energy into the electron transport chain anyway. And then in the electron transport chain, there are a number of iron proteins or heme-containing proteins in there, and there's less of that. And the important thing about this is that ferritin, which is the iron transport, one of the iron transport molecules in serum, the ferritin levels are inversely proportional to IQ in the kids. So the lower the ferritin, the lower the measurable IQ is. So for a mother or a parent starting out who wants to have their child have the best advantages in life, you really want to have this as high as possible. And so it's a really big disadvantage of a low iron diet. So iron loading occurs in utero. So mum eats the iron or the red meat or whatever. Mum's iron then is transferred to the fetus. The later that the mother can hold the fetus, the more iron that's transferred, because most iron transfer happens in the 3rd trimester. So typically on preemie babies, the more preemie they are, the lower the iron is. And the lower the iron is in the mother, the lower the iron is in the fetus. And this is critical because I know from questioning a lot of mothers that have children with developmental delay, one of the questions I ask them is, was your iron tested? Oh, yes, it was, and I was low. So we have here in the fetus or the mother with the fetus, they're being told they should be careful because their child is going to be iron deficient. It's not going to have enough iron. It's going to be compromised as far as the iron goes. So part of this talk is most of these deficiencies happen in the womb, and really with a lot more attention by the medicos, a lot of this could be prevented. So these are just the iron and sulfur proteins. You can look at them later. Here is an example of the mini mental score estimation. So you can see that in mild cognitive impairment, the activity of this enzyme, the one that has the iron in it, the iron sulfur, that's higher than when you get to Alzheimer's disease and it drops off. So as ferritin drops, then these drop as well. So this is in adults with dementia, but considering we can't measure the mini mental score of the kids who can't tell us things and can't answer questionnaires, this is what's going on. And so I see some of these, and they'd be off the scale down here as far as the mini mental score because the activity of this enzyme is terrible. I have some where the activity might only be 10% of normal, so they would be way down here. So that's with very low ferritin. So I get ferritin levels down at 12. I had one today, it was 7. It was atrocious. So here is some representative scattergram data of children with autism or developmental delay. And you could see that as this number gets higher, this would be going lower. You can see the majority of them have very high conatase levels. So this is what the representative is in the population. If this is normal, if this is 100% efficiency, then as you go up, 50%, 25%, etc. So these guys are losing buckets of energy in this one little step, citric acid cycle. So they're trying to get it in here, and it doesn't go, and it's excreted as citrate in urine because this is a urinary acid. So you get a drop in many mineral score acid. So this is why iron is critically important for your baby. You want this baby to be fiery. You want all this energy to go in and be processed in this cycle. So it's very important that people realize the consequences, in my opinion. So iron deficiency starts when ferritin is below 70. And in the Scandinavian continent, they are recommending that a woman supplement if her ferritin is below 70. The average woman in the United States, the childbearing age, has a ferritin level of 45. Not very promising.
No.
You haven't seen anything yet because it's just going to get worse. And so these are the consequences: poor oxygen transport, poor energy conversion, lower IQ. And one of the things they get is they get restless leg syndrome. So one of the things with the kids is a lot of them have twitching and uncontrolled movements, which is correlated with iron. And the low iron gives you EDS type symptoms, this floppy joints and hypermobility. So it's very important. So to me, that helps to add to your complexity of what you're dealing with a child with developmental delay. Some of them have got pure B12 deficiency, which can be resolved very quickly. They have a smaller list of symptoms. But potentially, if somebody was to look at this list and then say, go and then start ticking it off against what they're seeing in front of them, they could say, well, it's likely the child's also got iron deficiency, because then you know what you're going to have a look for. And this is the purpose of this. What should I look for? This is simple, but you know that for autism, there's a spectrum. So how can we explain the spectrum? You're starting to get a feel for the complexity of what's going on. But we're talking about new age autism. And in new age autism, we believe this is due to functional vitamin B2 deficiency, which is sitting on top of this functional B12 deficiency. So what are the consequences of this? What can we see as far as symptoms or whatever in the children? And what does this mean for them? There's some really, really nasty statistics. 50% of mothers in Boston maternity wards have less than the recommended daily intake of iodine. This is in a highly educated city in the US, and 50% of the mothers. This is in the Goiter Belt. This is an area where iodine deficiency was identified 100 years ago to the year. Yet here we are 100 years later, and 50% of the mothers have less than the recommended daily allowance of iodine. 30% of the kids have iodine deficiency. Now, this figure is mirrored in Australia as well. So the Australian Thyroid, I've been talking to the Australian Thyroid Association, and they are saying the same thing. And it's the single most preventable cause of developmental delay. It's been known for over 100 years. And here we are. What have we learned? Nothing. So that's one. So that's an old one. There's a new one coming on the block. It's selenium deficiency. The soils are getting very old. We're using up our selenium. And what I find from the hair metals test analysis is 46% of the kids are selenium deficient. And molybdenum deficiency is massive in the US now. The mining of molybdenum has been decreasing for the last 5 years. So the amount of molybdenum in the soil is also decreasing. And 75% of the kids that I have are molybdenum deficient. So we have 3 mineral deficiencies here, and all of them contribute to functional vitamin B2 deficiency. And this is what I believe is new age autism. So functional B2 deficiency, what causes it and what does it mean? So these 3 metals are involved in the conversion of vitamin B2 to one of the active analogues of vitamin B2, which is FAD. 2 of the B2 derivatives are required for B12 cycling. So if you're deficient in these, then the B12 can't cycle, so you'll have functional B12 deficiency. In addition, B2 is required for burning of fat for energy. And one of the markers that you see in the organic acids test, you see these fatty acid markers go up and up and up, and some of them are quite extreme. It's required for burning of sugar for energy. And one of the markers you look at in the organic acid is lactic acid. And this can go up and up and up and up, which we see. It's required for burning of glycogenic amino acids. So if you can't burn fat or sugar for energy, you burn amino acids. It's required for processing of oxalate. And one of the common things that people see in children with developmental delay is elevated oxalates. And there's a scare about whether oxalates are causing or not, but it's a consequence of the B2 deficiency. It's used in the electron transport chain. So here we have, again, it's used in conveying energy down the transport chain. So if this is deficient, then you can eat as much as you like, eat a lot of fat, you can't convert it, eat a lot of sugar, you can't convert it, eat a lot of protein, you can't convert it, but that which you can convert, you lose on the electron transport chain. So now you have a child who seems to be eating a lot, if you can get a child who eats a lot, because often they don't, but then they're not getting any energy. And so obesity is a problem later on for some of the kids. They get big. It's also required for iron processing. And what I've noticed is that talking to, and this is where you need to talk to the mothers, what's the child eating? Why is the child iron deficient? Why is it B12 deficient? You can find that sometimes that they're eating a lot of red meat, but they're still iron deficient. And that's because B2 as FAD and B12 are both required for iron processing in the gut. So if you don't have this, then you can eat all the iron you want to, but you can't transport it and you can't use it inside the cell. It's also required for vitamin B6 activation. Possibly not that well known, but it's fairly obvious. So because of these deficiencies, you get massive energy loss and you get typical underweight babies. And so this is a thing when you look at a lot of the babies, they're in the lower quartile of weights. They're skinny little things, no tone. It's not all of them, but preemie babies tend to be underweight as well. I'm moving to something else that you know happens in the kids. And a lot of the kids, temper control is an issue. And one of the ways we control temper and we control movement is with a transmitter called GABA. So it's an inhibitory transmitter. Now, GABA is involved. So GABA, you require an active form of B2, which is FMN, which then makes this active form of pyridoxal or vitamin B6. You get lower GABA, you get poor emotional control, you get poor fine motor control, and you get epilepsy. So epilepsy is one of the things that's very common in these children. And so why is it? So here we have controls here and here. They've got pyridyl phosphate in the controls, but they don't have the active form in autism. They have this pyridyl phosphate is involved in an enzyme that converts glutamate to GABA. So if you don't have it, the glutamate precursor is elevated, and elevated glutamate is known in children with developmental delay and reduced production of GABA. So now you have a child who gets out of control. They can't turn it off because they're not making GABA. They have fine motor skill, lack of control, because they can't, if they're doing something too rapidly, they can't damp it down, they can't control it. So this is another aspect of vitamin B2 deficiency causing another range of symptoms in the spectrum. And curiously, when I did the SNP analysis of this, the genetic analysis, one of the things that did come up more often in children with autism was increased mutations in the enzyme GAD. And the enzyme GAD is this one that does this. So it was curious that it was there, and it's only in autism, it's not in chronic fatigue, it's not in MS, and it's not in the control population, but there were actually more of these kids who had mutations. So it's the only genetic marker that I've really been able to find that can explain some of the behavior. So that's a behavioral issue. So this would help you to work out, perhaps this is an issue. Now, how would I know this? Or what would be something that tells me to look for this? So when I go to the doctor and the doctor gives me an enhancer of GABA. And if you look at it, that's what a lot of the kids are on. They're on GABA agonists. So that to me tells me the kid ain't making enough GABA. So we're going to give it some more. Well, why not fix this deficiency? Why not make the child do this? Why feed them a drug when you can just fix the nutrition? So there's a high incidence of epilepsy in autism, and treatment of epilepsy involves GABA agonists, which is what I'm talking about. So in functional B2 deficiency, there will be the B6 deficiency, and that will result in GABA insufficiency. And as I said, there's a high percentage of GABA mutations we're seeing in ASD. So here's a ref on it. The other thing that B2 is involved in, which maybe it's less than 1% of the general population knows, and seems to be even less than that of the medical profession knows, is that vitamin B2 is essential for making bisanilate, B6, and it's essential for making FAD, which is here, and it's even essential for making FMN and FAD. So if these two are deficient, you can't get this cycle that's going on. This is part of the methylation cycle, renewal of methylation cycle. So this gets blocked, and a lot of people will have had MTHFR mutations and jump up and down because the child's got MTHFR. We've all got MTHFR. It's whether we have enough B2 to make the thing run, which is it. And if you don't, then what happens is when you get this methyl group and you transfer the methyl group to homocysteine, you make methionine. Methionine goes on to make SAM, which we said is really important for production of melatonin, adrenaline, creatine. If this isn't cycling, this is reduced. And so the methylation pathway depends upon FAD and the active form of B6 and methylfolate. And these are standard things that the kids are treated with. But this is why. The other thing that happens is if you don't have your methylfolate and you make this cobalt-1, this is sort of an active form of thing, the methyls group's left, it's gone over here. And that, when it sits around, comes oxidized, and you make this inactive form of B12, cobalt-2B12. But if you're B2 deficient, you can regenerate this to make it. The problem is the kids are not B2 deficient. So what happens, sufficient, sorry. So what happens is that this builds up. And this is what is seen in serum. You have this paradoxical B12 deficiency. The levels of B12 in serum are very high, but it's inactive. And this is what I believe is the form of B12 that's in serum. And it comes from this functional B2 deficiency. So this is new age autism. This is autism where B12 looks good. When we actually go and do the metabolic analysis, we see it's not active. This is part of the process that does it. So B2 is essential for this cycle. This is FAD here. It's also essential for processing. We said glycolysis gets to pyruvate. Pyruvate is then converted and it goes in the electron transport chain. This won't happen unless you've got B2. So this last enzyme here requires B2 and B1, and I think all lipoamide. And so if this is not here, that's not made. Or this, it goes to lactate. So it's not converted, so they lose energy. So B2 is involved in processing. So here are just some graphs to show the same thing. It's involved in metabolism of fats. So here we have a whole bunch of little markers that are in organic acids. In the control, the levels are low. And in the children with autism, you see they're much, much higher. There's a block. These things are accumulating. They're not being digested. So this is lack of energy. Here's lactose, which is the bottom, lactic acid, which is lactate, sorry, there, which is the bottom of the glycolysis. And a lot of them are put on B1 deficient diets and pyruvate goes up. It's terrible. It's all there in the oat. Just got to look at it. And here's the electron transport chain, and here's the enzymes that require FMN and FAD. So if these are deficient because the energy transfers work, and one of the ways you see that is they've got very elevated succinate, which occurs in the organic acids test. So it's a way of monitoring what's going on. And this seems to be related to the FMN. So it's another marker for B2. So we've gone through it all, put it all together, what have we got? If we disrupt myelination, if we don't have vitamin D and we don't have active B12, then we can have significant effects on the brain function, basically. It also speed of conduction. It slows the conduction in the auditory and visual systems. And this is fairly typical in autism. I mean, the number of kids with glasses is much higher, and their hearing is often compromised. And so most of these brain systems are myelinating during early developmental period. So once the kid has come out of the womb, I mean, it's not seeing much while it's in the womb. So it makes sense it'll do things once it's out. It's not listening to much, it's not listening to much, well, it's hearing a bit from mum's voice. But that's when this period of myelination goes, as they come on. And then, of course, once it gets out, it's got this big environment and it's going to learn things. And so it requires cognitive skills. So if you retard myelination of the brain in infancy, you're going to get this delayed of cognitive skills. And you can also see brain atrophy in the kids. The brains are actually smaller because myelin is actually thick. So it makes the brain look bigger. So this is the summary, basically, then the deficiency of the active B12 due to the lack of, or cause the lack of creatine and melatonin, and that combined with deficiency of vitamin D leads to significant developmental delay. Now, it's hard in my mind to pick out which of these is contributing the most to the increase in the rate of autism or developmental delay, because vitamin D deficiency is becoming a real problem worldwide. So much so that rickets, which was also abolished 100 years ago, has now come to the fore. So suddenly you have these kids with low bone densities and everything else. You have people wearing lots of high SPF makeup, and mum's vitamin D levels are low. You have people who cover up a lot, and so vitamin D levels low. Which is most important? Hard to say. So this all fits under the nexus theory. So how do we fix it? That's the main thing. So I'll explain what I think goes on. How do you fix it? Which involves fixing these deficiencies first, and then you can then fix the vitamin D and iron deficiency, and then hopefully start to get development to occur. But what I would like to point out is if you do not fix this, you cannot fix the rest. And in the kids that are making progress, you see this happens rapidly. And the kids that have got much slower progress, you see that this hasn't been fixed. So that's critical. Just for a note of clarification, I tend to use the scientific symbols for these things. So I is iodine, of course. Se is selenium, and Mo is molybdenum. So these are the three molecules that are involved in activation of B2 in different situations. Iodine is used to make thyroid hormone. Selenium is used in the conversion of thyroid hormone T4 to T3. And so you need selenium there. And molybdenum is the final step in converting FMN to FAT. So you need all of these three to activate vitamin B2. So that's iodine, selenium, molybdenum to activate B2. And you see that B2 is involved in B12 cycling. So if you don't fix this, you just tend to get more B12 that's inactive. So you need to fix this first so you can then use your B12 supplements or topical. Oral doesn't work. And then when you've done that, because of all of this is involved in processing iron and vitamin D, you need to fix this first so you can then activate these things and process them. If you don't do that, you can add in, and you see people who are feeding their kids lots of iron and stuff. It's not making any difference until you fix this. They're all required, but this is the critical step. You have to do this first.
A lot of people are going to ask, how long does it take to fix?
So this is a question I get asked often, and you have to think about this a little bit in your own mind. So if you've got a child who's neurotypical, who develops normally, they don't come out of the womb walking, talking, dancing, and riding bicycles. It takes them a while to do it. And my grandson is 2 now. He can ride a trike. He walks and he talks. He puts together sentences that have got more than 10 words. He can describe things with colour. He knows nouns and verbs and adjectives, puts them in the right order in sentences, and his fine motor skills are pretty good. His vitamin D levels are up. He's outside. So that took him 2 years to get to there.
Yeah.
Now, comes from the womb. He has everything. So he's got, he would, if he's my grandson, but of course he's got all the right gear, and his mother's fed him the right gear, and we made sure that while she was pregnant, she had all the right gear. And so that's neurotypical. So that takes 2 years. If you delay that, well, it's not going to happen tomorrow. They still have to fix themselves. If I take a woman who was B12 sufficient, I have an example of a woman who's B12 sufficient, and she gradually became just B12 efficient, not the rest, not the iron and not the vitamins. And we started her on B12. Now, she was so bad that she couldn't stand up without assistance. She'd fall over. She couldn't feel. So you've got to think that this is happening with the children too. So you're assuming that they can do all of these things. So don't assume that they can do it. She couldn't feel the temperature of the floor with her feet. She couldn't even feel the clothing on her skin. So she'd lost that sensation. It took 2 years to fix the myelination. So she threw away the walker. She could stand on one leg. She could feel the cold and everything else, and she didn't have brain fog. So it doesn't happen instantly. You don't have a child who's running and throwing a ball when they come out of the womb. They're still not throwing a ball and hitting a target at 2 years. So don't expect that, today you're going to get on the program and tomorrow the child's going to do it. And remember, of course, you have to get that right. If you don't, you're just delaying it. And so then you have to let normal development go. Go and have a look at what a 3-year-old does, what a neurotypical 3-year-old does, and what a neurotypical 5-year-old does. And you say, well, that's what happens in 2 years. Then go back and see a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and then put your child somewhere in that and say, well, it took that child 2 years to get to this process. There are odd things, there are coordination things that they have to learn. The brain has to repeatedly do things, and that repetition doesn't happen until you fix it. So if you want to learn to hop, you've got to fall over a few times, and then you learn to hop. You've got to have all the balance, you've got auditory canals going, you have to have all of this. Takes myelination. Myelination takes about 18 years. So bits of the brain myelinate earlier, but some of the others you've got all these limbs growing.
Obviously, prevention is key in identifying the markers before you even get pregnant or during pregnancy. And then you've obviously got the parents like myself who have older children who have started the protocol maybe a little bit later than others. So the progress, it's going to take a lot longer. And one thing, from personal experience and the wider ASD community, at least in the UK, is that a lot of people are being fed that there are these quick fixes to helping the biochemistry, like we touched on earlier with CoQ10, GABA supplementation, creatine, or people think that there may be some sort of minimization of certain symptoms with the supplementation of certain things, and then all of a sudden the supplements stop working, and then it's this evil cycle. I see it throughout the community.
So just remember that in your brain, if you want to turn a signal off, it's very local. So you have a GABA producing neuron and it goes bang, and turns the neuron that it's attached to off. If you flood the body with a GABA agent, it doesn't know what it's turning off.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. The body does it very specifically. And what you find is when these kids get on drugs, they become addicted to them. SSRIs are one of the ones, the most evil things they get addicted to. And you've got to get them off it. GABA agonists are the same. And you have to get them off. The body have to say, hey, I'm making 50 times as much of this stuff as I need. Yeah. And also you have to remember that if a child is active and neurotypical children are very active. They run around, they're impossible to deal with. They've got so much energy, they're running over this and doing everything. If you have a child who's sort of doing that and then you feed them something or give them something and they don't do it, don't be thinking you're fixing them.
Yeah.
You might just be dumbing them down so they're sitting in a semi-stuporous state that you can deal with. Let's not fix the child. Remember, development takes a while. You can't do that in 30 seconds. It's not an aspirin.
No.
They've still got to play catch up. They've still got to myelinate the nerves. Everything, all the computer has to sit and make all its connections. It has to reinforce the connections. So the brain has to learn. There's 5 layers of processing in the brain. You go into the British Museum, it's got a fantastic diagram of what's going on. But one of the things that just amazes me about development is you've got 2 eyes. You get 2 signals from those eyes. You have to merge them. You have to convert them into 3D. You have to overlap the colors of those 2 signals. And then you have to find something that's clear. That requires myelination. And one of the things with the kids is often they turn sideways and look at you with one eye, if you're lucky. They can't merge the 2 signals. So you have to really be a little cognizant of, it's fascinating what's going on in the brain, which is probably why I like, dealing with this, but it's just absolutely fascinating. It's well understood by those who really, really know. It's poorly understood by most of us, the general public. And we just don't realize, how much of a supercomputer we're building in, all the intensity, all the learning that has to go. And also, you may be multilingual. And I'm sort of I've learned a bit of Latin and a bit of French, but we tried to learn Spanish. And I can tell you, learning a new language as an adult is quite hard. Now, you have a child there who doesn't know whether you're talking about nouns, verbs, or whatever. You're going gobbly, gobbly, gobbly in front of them. And often the parents just keep talking. And somehow, neurotypical child picks out, they're talking about the cat. That's with everything functioning. Now, you try and put that underwater and not receive the sounds properly. You can't even work out whether you've got stereo going on, and you have all these problems. Be patient with the children. They have to learn all of that stuff that we all took for granted with kids. They still have to do it. They still have to do all that processing. 5 layers of processing. Imagine sitting down in your lounge room with a whole bunch of wiring and then try to get 5 layers of that working, and you're not an electrician. This was the conclusion that we had from it, and you should get there. Lack of B2, B12, and iron all result in lower energy output. The lack of the 3 of those plus vitamin D result in lower activation of vitamin D, and the lack of the combination results in lower myelination. Lack of myelination reduces the conduction speed in the brain, which is we're talking, it's a stimulation, and reduces the ability of the brain to process and use information. And that's what we're talking about. It's getting all these signals. What does it mean? How do I process it? The lack of B12 results in lower melatonin, which gives you this lack that we said of myelination, but it also gives you the sleep disorders, which is common in the kids, and gut disorders. And the lack of iodine and selenium results in lower activation of B6, which results in lower GABA, which is poorer behavioural control and epilepsy. I didn't quite go through that much, but this is an indication of where your deficiencies are. And of course, different individual deficiencies will cause slightly different symptoms. And you get your spectrum. And how bad it is, you get your spectrum. You get the difference in behaviours from them. And people try and lump them all together. Well, they all have a different background. So why is this important? We're doing this retrospectively. We would really like no parent to have to go through the ordeal of this. But it is a cost thing. For a pinch of salt a day, which isn't much in 9 months, we could prevent this. And the rate is going up. So by 2030, the rate in Northern Ireland will be 7%. This is of kids with autism or developmental delay, 5.5 in Scotland, 5% England, 4.5 in Wales. It's a massive number. Here's the graph showing the increase in those. It's preventable by a pinch of salt a day, as I've been saying. The cost is astronomical. And in Australia now, to put a child into a special school, if you've got the money, the government is forking out $60,000 a year per child. This is a massive cost to society. A third of our NDIS budget is going on something that could prevent it with a pinch of salt a day. I have contacted several organisations to try and see what we can do about this, because the information is on the web. The information is on the National Health Systems of Australia, UK and USA. It's there. The suggestions are there, but nobody reads them. So what can we do about that? I think that that's one of the biggest things I would like to get out of this little series that we have, is how can we make people more aware? How can we just get a little pinch of salt? We take pregnancy multivitamins or whatever and get it right. But I think I'm optimistic.
That's good. It's very tricky. And as you know, I mean, I've been trying to get it right the last 3 years with Con, and it's still a struggle. I am optimistic.
Yeah, so this is another thing that I found, that there's a lot of kids where the parents have said the child was doing really well, it's coming along, starting to achieve milestones and everything else, and then they got COVID. Yep. Or annoyingly, they got the COVID vaccine. Now, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. The side effects of the vaccine were that they're very high consumers of B2 and iron and vitamin D. And as we've been stressing, that these are critical for B12, and macrophages are big consumers of energy. So this is unfortunate time for a setback. Just remember that when you get an infection in the lung, it's a huge surface area. You get so many cells that are activated, and they're so demanding. And I have some kids who have taken 4 months to normalize or to get their organic acids test back to where they were before they got COVID. So it's not quick. And I have my own organic acids, which I'm testing. I had COVID I was triple vaccinated. I had COVID basically for 2 days, and my markers went up for 3 months. So I know that it's a real thing. I know it's happening. I've got my 4th one coming up, and I'm going to see it now. I've also been on the ISMO and stuff. I don't have any side effects. I don't have any symptoms. You wouldn't know. Well, you might know. I don't know. Others around me might say it's very different. So biochemically, it's affected me for that amount of time. So in a child who's sitting right on the edge of nutritional sufficiency or hasn't even got there, we must expect the same thing is going to happen.
You're so right. And I think that's a good message to get out to people, not to give up at that stage, but you've got to push through it, supporting the body with the right nutrients.
One of the things that I've been quite surprised with is that my daughter became pregnant, and of course you want them to have the best thing. So I started to look at pregnancy multivitamins and whether they work or they don't work. When you look at the composition of some, and of course a lot of women have asked me the same question, you know, what can I use as a multivitamin? And I've been extremely disappointed that big, well-known companies have formulated products that don't even dissolve. And the formulated products, which I know won't work, one of which my daughter was on, and I could see from the data that the selenium or the selenite in the product was not working. She had normal TSH levels, which means the iodide was working, but her T3 was out of the range low. So the selenite in the product was not working. What seems to be the case is they try to put everything in the multi, everything you might need, iron, calcium, magnesium. They're trying to do the right thing, except they're not formulation chemists. So they're not working out what binds to what and what doesn't. So if you mix calcium, which is Ca double plus, with anything that's a double minus, it forms a complex. And with calcium and copper and magnesium, if you mix them with folate, they precipitate. If you mix them with selenite, which is the right form to have, they precipitate, become insoluble. And if you mix them with molybdenate, which is the right form, it also becomes insoluble. And so you get no effect. Now, it's kind of annoying because at the end of the day, people said, can you make a product? And so I've made a topical product, which it's just the three of them in it, or you can get them single. And we can see from the hair metals test analysis that this stuff is getting in, you see the levels go up and you see the biochemistry change. So I can see from the data that I have that this product works. But I have a lot of people who can't get it all. They want to start and they go on some sort of multivitamin, and we go back and we have a look and the multivitamin's not working. You know, much as I love making the product and I don't want to do that for the rest of my life. I would like these people to actually get together and make a product that you, as the mothers, could use and know that it was going to work. Now, if you have to take two, if you have to take one that's just a mineral supplement and then take one for the iron and the others, that's fine. But let at least get, I mean, I think is there Pregnacare in the UK? And then
yeah, there's Pregnacare. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've looked at Pregnacare as well, and that has, well, most of them don't have molybdenate in it anyway, so that's it. But there is good news on the horizon. And the good news is they didn't used to have iodine, iodide, or selenite in them at all. So somebody out there said, we need this. So somebody's recognized that there's a problem. And then if you go and have a look at the different types of things that are in them, there's bits of rock, which will be some oxide or something which is basically just seems to be ground up rock that they put in there. There's various sorts of chelates which are not useful. So the people that are trying to formulate them don't really know, but they think we've got to have it in there. I'll put it on and I'll buy it. I even had an interesting one today where these people were claiming that their product had had an advantage on mental function in those with early dementia. So I contacted them about what the formulation was, and they said, oh, it's proprietary, we can't tell. So I can't even tell whether they've got the right stuff in there. So I'd have to buy it and then test it and see. So it's frustrating. It would be great if I could just say, hey, go buy this one. Frustratingly, most of the chemists got no idea about it. The other frustrating bit about this is I was speaking to the Australian Thyroid Association today. They have no real idea what iodine does apart from make T4. They don't know that it's involved in the activation of B2. They don't know the other factors that are involved in it. That's very disappointing. I think that we should be able to rely on these things. We should be able to go to these associations. They'll tell us what it is. But by the same token, most people are not even making that step. Do I have a tablet or a formulation that I could guarantee would work that's oral? No. Can I make you one? Yes. Am I going to? Maybe.
Thank you.
It's important that at least we have one foundation on board if it's going to do something with it, and hopefully your ability to gain exposure to it will help us, and hopefully a couple of doctors will get on board, and hopefully mothers will go and get the right supplement, and we'll start to turn our graph downwards.
That would be wonderful.
I can retire and go and live over here.
I can see how much improvement Con has made despite all of our setbacks. This was a child, as you know, when I came to you in utter desperation 3 years ago, this was a child who didn't sleep. This was a child who couldn't read, couldn't write. couldn't really speak, couldn't take him anywhere because he was so aggressive, or he would flop to the ground. He was headbanging as well. And slowly, we are tweaking and supporting his biochemistry, and he's getting there. It's a very long, windy road with roadblocks along the way, but we're getting there. It's really, really important that the message gets out there.
I've got to take my hat off to you mothers who are looking after these children. Really, I mean, it's so heartbreaking and soul destroying, and you have to be so patient and persistent. And you guys are the people that should be congratulated and given the awards. It's not me, it's you guys that are doing it on a day-to-day basis.
Well,
never underestimate the ability of mother's love.
No, this is very true. Very true. But without your support and your knowledge and all your research, none of us would be in this position where we can actually help our children. So don't forget that. It's not just us. So thank you from everyone.
Well, thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, as always.
All right. Well, thank you too. Good night.